The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
My baby dolls, we are back again, another episode of Genesis. As always, I'm your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and today we're going into Latin America, folks. Love this type of baseball history. We're bringing back Lou Hernandez, who we've had on twice before. We're going back, and we're going to be talking about memories of winter ball. And Lou Hernandez did his homework here, I'll tell you, and he was gifted by talking to all these players who played in the winter ball leagues. And that's in Latin America. We're talking about the Dominican Republic. We're talking about Puerto Rico. We're talking about Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama. And we're talking about Venezuelan leagues, all these leagues. And he had the opportunity to interview these guys. And we're going to get some of their insights, and we're going to have him on in about another 2 minutes. But, of course, as always, we break the station identification. You are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho. And, I just love being on the network. Show's been on here over a year now. I've had the show now for 3 years. Of course, my old network, the producer decided to retire on it, and so I was left without a network. But the network is growing here. We're getting Gladstone, who wrote a fantastic book, A Bit of Cup of Coffee, about how Major League Baseball threw these guys who played in baseball before 1980 and were more or less retired before 1980, how Major League Baseball threw them a curve and did not give them health benefits and pension plans, and how they were locked out of the 1980 collective bargaining agreement between the union and baseball, and it was a huge oversight. A lot of these guys suffered in life when Bud Selig did give permission to give them a stipend. A lot of these guys, like my good buddy Jimmy Driscoll up in New Hampshire, the first thing he did with his check was fix his water heater. Now, most of the Major League Baseball players today, I think the minimum pension is $64,000 a year, with the maximum being in the $200,000. So if you are making all these millions of dollars all these years, chances are you're going to be making $200,000 in your retirement as a baseball player. And he's going to be getting his own show and interviewing a lot of these players who were left out of the bargaining deal. And, of course, they're all in their 70s and 80s. But it's something that needs to be brought to light, just like the other factions I advocate, which include the Negro Leagues, the Latin American leagues, also women in baseball, Ty Cobb in that whole dead ball era. So I guess you guys are going to, and gals are going to be learning something very interesting, very important. Tune in to listen. But now, hey, we turn to Lou Hernandez. He's a member of Society of American Baseball Research, otherwise known as SABR, and a lifelong baseball fan. We had him on for his other two books, which was The Rise of the Latin Players from 1947 and 1961, and also the Latin Pitchers, the Great Latin Pitchers. And I had fun on both those shows. And without any further ado, welcome to the show, Lou.
Thank you, Ian. Pleased to be with you.
Now, let me ask you something. How long did this take? You had to send a letter to all these guys who played in all these leagues, and they had to remember 70-something odd years before.
Yeah, let me just give you a background to the book. As you mentioned, my first book was Rise of the Latin American Baseball Leagues, which covered a narrative history of the winter leagues of the late 1940s and 50s when they first joined organized baseball. So I wanted to follow that book up with an oral history of the same subject in the same time period. And by doing that, I contacted approximately 140 surviving players from that era. This was 2011. Actually, the book came out in 2011, so this was 2010, a year before. I sent out letters, as you mentioned, and I was able to get replies and speak to a total of 51. So I batted better than 333 in that respect. But Yeah, I sent out letters. I sent out 2 letters. If I didn't hear back from them after 2 letters, I figured they weren't interested for whatever reason. But with each letter, I indicated or I put in a return envelope, postage paid, so they can just send it back to me with their phone number, or if they wanted to meet in person for local players, they could do that as well. You know, the best time to reach them and their phone number, of course. As I said, I was able to speak to these players. I also got a chance to travel in writing the book. I went to Puerto Rico. I took a trip there. I spent a weekend in Puerto Rico, and I met a couple of retired players there. That was probably the highlight of the project.
How far is Puerto Rico from Florida? About 2 hours by airplane?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit more than Florida to New York. So, yeah, a little bit over 2 hours. But that was a fun experience.
Now, let me ask you, because that also explains the unevenness of how many players you were able to interview in the index here. That said, like, the Mexican League, you were able to get Monty Irvin, Evans, Killian, whereas for the Cuban Winter League, you have about 12, and for the Puerto Rican League, you have a lot more. But let me ask you something. When you interviewed these guys and seeing what they went through geographically, weather, what they ate, does all these leagues have something in common, or they remain their unique identities?
Well, they all, all the Hispanic countries, they all have their own unique culture. But I think the uniqueness was the people and the enthusiasm for baseball. I think that's what I got most from the players. It was pretty uniform in that respect. All the countries really had an ardent fan base, and they all really had a great appreciation for good baseball, and really great fans of the sport.
And you know what? Let's get into a couple of these guys in the Cuban Winter League. We'll start with George Altman first. How did he view the league, and what did he learn from playing in the Winter Leagues in Cuba?
George Altman, because alphabetically I started listing the players alphabetically, so he's the first interview in the book, and he was a great person to speak to, a well-spoken person, really thinks out his answers when you speak to him. He played on Cienfuegos, the 1960 Cuban League champion, and they were also the last Cuban team to win the Caribbean Series before the Cuban Revolution came over and ended all sports in Cuba. And he basically, his theme was like all the other players. They enjoyed the experience. It was an experience that they wouldn't trade for anything. It helped them in their pursuit of big league careers, because remember, these are players that are very early on in their careers. We're talking about North American players now, early on in their careers, and they go to the winter leagues to hone their trade and to try and get them, a faster track to the big leagues. And oftentimes, or most of the time, that really worked and it helped them.
You're absolutely right. And I think now is a good time to dive into Minnie Minoso, because he's probably the most well-known, and he just died, I think, 3 years ago. But he was called the Cuban Comet, and, there's a lot of times in the 1950s when he should have been voted the most valuable player, and he should be rightfully in the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned him. It was really a thrill to speak to him. I got a chance to speak to him. It took a while. I had to contact his agent, and his agent had to get me in touch with somebody else. But anyway, I ended up speaking to him. It was a thrill. When I spoke to him, you mentioned the Hall of Fame. He really was hoping the Veterans Committee was coming up for a vote, I think within the next year, and he was really hoping that he would get positive consideration on the ballot. But unfortunately, he didn't get the consideration he was due, and he ended up passing away without fulfilling his dream. That's all that was left for him in his career or in his life, he told me, to get a Cooperstown, not nomination, but Cooperstown election. And but speaking to him as a player, I always wanted to know where his nickname came from, because all the research I did, I was never able to find out, a legitimate type of answer. And it turns out when I asked him, he didn't even know. He told me that when he arrived in Chicago on a certain day, and in the newspapers he was Orestes Minoso, and the next day in the same newspapers he was Minnie Minoso. He doesn't remember which sports writer or how the name came to pass, but boy, that nickname sure stuck, and it's really a colorful one, reflective of the time, I think.
And like we were mentioning, I mean, for God's sakes, he played in a time where Latin Americans really started to have an impact on baseball. One of them was the Cuban Habanos down in Havana, which Gabe Paul was instrumental in bringing a lot of their players into the Cincinnati Reds system. He ended up in Chicago on the White Sox. Do you think him being in the American League rather than in the National League hindered some of the spotlight on him? Because the National League were more prevalent in bringing minorities into the league as opposed to pretty much the racist American leagues.
The American League, their teams were slow in integrating. I'm not sure if it hindered him in any way. His talent was his talent, and it came through all the teams he played for. I will mention on the fact of race that he was very proud of being called the Jackie Robinson of Latin American ball players. He credits Orlando Cepeda with dubbing him with that nickname. So that was one aspect of his career he was very, very proud of, and he always took his heritage with him. He told me onto the ballpark and onto the ball field. So I don't know if it hindered him in any way. His talent would have shined in whatever league he was in.
Yeah, it's funny because every time I post something about Minnie Minoso in my historical Negro League, they all say he should be. Him and Buck O'Neill, I think, get the most votes from the people in my group that they should both be in the Hall of Fame, and it's unfortunate they're not. I mean, he was a fantastic player, Minoso. Hey, here's a guy who's still alive, Mudcat Grant. What's going on with him?
Yeah, Mudcat Grant. He was a pretty insightful interview. He's a sort of a Renaissance man because he has a great talent for music, and he impressed me. And I told him so that he knew a lot of the Cuban music, Cuban singers, band players, things like that, and he said he had a great time in Cuba, and again, it was right before he jump-started his career with the Indians. He was later traded to Minnesota, and he kept a great friendship with Cuban players that were on the Minnesota Twins. The Twins in the 1960s had a lot of Hispanic players, mostly Cuban, and that came from their time previously as a Washington Senator franchise before moving to Minneapolis.
Good.
No, I was just going to say it was a great interview, and he always told me every time he comes to Florida that every time he passes through the food court at the airports here in Florida, he smells the Cuban food coming from the kiosks, and it takes him back to Havana more than 50 years ago. I thought that was a great.
Well, there's a big Cuban community down in southern Florida, and again, most of them were transplanted there for many years, even before the revolution. And that pretty much, they have a lot of families, I know, in Cuba, and of course that's a lifeline, or was a lifeline, for all the Cuban refugees that came across trying to escape Castro's Cuba. Right.
Well, South Florida is the exile capital of the United States for Cuban people. New Jersey, New York, that's also a big place. But South Florida, Miami in particular, that's the capital of Cuban exiles. As you mentioned, escaping Castro's Cuba.
Yeah, and now you know who I was really fascinated who played in the Cuban leagues? Bill Virdon. I didn't even realize he played down in the Cuban leagues.
Yeah, Bill Virdon, he was property of the Cardinals. I think he was, I want to say with Louisville at the time. And he and players like Dick Schofield, they also played down there. And Virdon was a long-time Pittsburgh Pirates member of their organization. He was a manager, Yankee manager as well. Yeah, Virdon was a good interview as far as knowing places and things like that. But I think he only spent 1 year down there, so he didn't have a lot of that type of remembrance as far as where to go and things that he had seen. But yeah, Bill Virdon was down there. I think that, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, that the next year before the Cardinals called him up, he led the International League in hitting.
Yeah, that's right. I believe he did. I know he managed the Yankees twice in the mid-'70s. I remember being 4 years old. They hired him, but they had some problems with him. They got rid of him immediately with Steinbrenner.
Yeah, but he had a long career in baseball, and when I spoke to him, he was still working with the Pirates as a part-time coach in spring training.
Yeah, wow. Now, you know what's interesting? In the Dominican leagues, I didn't realize that Bill White played down in the Dominican leagues. How was Bill to contact? That must have been something.
Yeah, Bill White played in the Dominican leagues, and he also played in Puerto Rico. He was on a team in the Dominican League called Escogido, the Lions. They were the perennial champions of the league. They were based in the capital of, now it's called Santo Domingo. Back then it was called Ciudad Trujillo after the Dominican dictator Trujillo. But Bill White learned quite a bit of Spanish, he told me, in particular in Puerto Rico. When he went to Puerto Rico, he had already gotten married, and he had a 2-year-old daughter. Can't remember her name right now, but he said just something funny. He said she learned to speak Spanish before she learned to speak English because she was down there with him playing. Yeah,
I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, a lot of these guys. I mean, you got Stan Williams here. Stan Williams and Norm Sherry, huge players played in the Dominican leagues.
Yeah, Stan Williams was one of many New York Giant players and Brooklyn Dodger players, because the Giants and the Dodgers, they were the first to recognize Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic as a future hotbed for Latin American talent. Before that, basically most of the players came from Cuba, but the Giants progressively and the Dodgers, they were of course the most progressive team in the major leagues. They turned to both of those islands, and they sent their players down there to get seasoning. And as you mentioned, those two players, Williams and what was the other player? I'm sorry.
That's all right. The other one was Norm Sherry.
Yeah, they went down there as well. Yep.
And you got Monty Irvin in here, and I love Monty Irvin. If there was ever a guy who was probably the most prolific hitter, not only in the Negro leagues but also in the Latin American leagues, he was it. It must have been something to interview Monty.
Yeah, Monty Irvin was a great interview, very well-spoken gentleman. Of course, you could tell he had done hundreds and thousands of interviews over the course of his life, but he told me a lot about his early career. When he first signed out of Newark, New Jersey, he signed with the Negro Leagues. And I'll tell you, as far as the Negro Leagues are concerned, it didn't matter what color the owners were, because they all treated their players very miserly. Monty Irvin told me that he signed for pennies, and this was with the Newark Eagles, I should mention. And in fact, the salary was so poor he had to go to Mexico to play. The second year with the Eagles, he decided not to play with them because the salary that was offered to him was so low. So he went down to Mexico, which Mexico was actually a summer league. They were the only league that didn't play in the winter. They were a summer league. This was 1943. He went down there, and Irvin won the Triple Crown down there.
It was fantastic. And I think Roy Campanella was down there with him. They were opposing sides, I believe, at the same time.
They were on different teams down there. And Irvin was unique because he actually played in multiple winter leagues besides Mexico. He also played in Havana. He played in Puerto Rico, so he got around. And again, most of the time it was this is really I guess the majors were on the cusp of integration. This was the late 1940s. So again, it was to earn money over the holidays or over the professional league break here in the U.S. And in Havana, he was with the Almendares team, the first team to win the Caribbean Series. He was starting outfielder with Al Gianfrido, and I can't remember his other name right now. Oh, San Jethro, that's who it was. And Almendares won the first Caribbean Series championship in 1949. They swept the competition. They won their six games in a row, and so Irvin got around in the winter leagues.
And again, you can't talk about the Mexican League without talking about Jorge Pascual. Huge. I mean, I'm writing a book on labor relations right now, and he always comes up as like the bandit who was stealing all the Negro League players and all the Major League Baseball players. The Happy Chandler had to say, anyone going down there, you can't come back to the majors for 5 years. It became that alluring for Jorge Pascual. What did Irvin say about Pascual?
He called him the George Steinbrenner of Mexico. So Pascual was sort of like the George Steinbrenner type before George Steinbrenner. A man that had a lot of money. He liked publicity. He liked to see his name in the paper. Unlike George Steinbrenner, Pascual he managed one of his teams down there. This was after he had to give up his role of owner of the league. In 1946, when he started rating the U.S. for ball players, he was actually the owner of the league. He had taken control of the league by buying controlling interests of all the clubs down there. That didn't last for very long because everything went south with the Mexican peso devaluating, and he couldn't continue to pay the salaries that he was paying. The attendance didn't support the salaries, and of course he got big backlash from Mexican players who were being really underpaid compared to the North American players that were being brought in. So he was a very colorful figure and a very important man in not only in Mexican baseball but in U.S. baseball, because his raids really laid the foundation for the first type of labor movement in the United States for U.S. ball players. After the amnesty was granted by Commissioner Chandler, players sat down with the owners and they actually got representation to file grievances with owners over things. One of the things I remember that came out of all of that was a stipend for spring training. Before then, players never got paid until the first day of the season with their first starts of games. But after the raiding in Mexico, one of the benefits players got was actually a stipend for spring training. So that was something, and he was an important figure. He's more or less a footnote, but he should be more of a footnote in Major League Baseball history as far as the players are concerned too. He's sort of like Kurt Flood. He's a player a person that's not appreciated as far as labor relations with the players. But again, he's 40 years before flood.
And that stipend that the players got in spring training, it was after Robert Murphy, who was the union guy. He tried to create a union in '46, and he was able to come to an agreement with Major League Baseball that these guys, they don't get paid to the first day. Do you know that Murphy's money is still given out with all these record-breaking salaries? They still get a stipend for spring training, the players.
I believe it. The pendulum has swung so far the other way now. That doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah, and you know who Monty Irvin got up against, which I loved, was one of my favorite pitchers, who you can actually make a case for, and he's in the Hall of Fame. That might be the best pitcher of all time, Martin DeHigo. I mean, I love the story that Monty told about, they struck him out 3 times in the game. What in talking to Monty, how do you feel about Marty?
Well, he called him a great pitcher. He obviously recognized his talent. Diego was talk about Triple Crowns. He won the Triple Crown, I think, in 1938 in Mexico pitching. Most wins, most strikeouts in the league ERA champ. Irvin recognized Diego's talent, as did everyone.
Now, Diego was just a fantastic pitcher. If you were to ask me if he and Satchel Paige were allowed to play during the times, again, with Garrick and all the others in the late 30s, I don't even think there'd be a Yankee dynasty that lasted from 36 to 1939 if they were on other teams, because that's how prevalent they were. I think they think the two of them outshined any pitcher in the Major League Baseball at the time, and it's unfortunate that they weren't allowed to play.
Yeah, that's baseball's biggest black eye, definitely. Right. But you talk to black ball players that they made the best of it. They had their own leagues, and I remember watching Ken Burns' baseball and seeing I guess it was Buck O'Neill who was on there, and he always made the best of it, saying that they had their leagues and they're great players, and in many respects they wouldn't have traded that for anything.
And it also was a thing for the African American communities that not only was this a game of recreation, but besides church, the Negro Leagues provided a lot of income coming into these communities, restaurants and, clothes, manufacturing. So the Negro Leagues was important to the economy of these places they played in, which shifts the question of, with all these leagues, how is the income going into the economy from all these countries? Was it a big factor? Did people come out just to see it for recreation, or was it a source of income they really needed?
Yeah, as far as whether it produced a lot of jobs, I don't know. I mean, the jobs you would think would be mostly in the hospitality end of it for accommodating the players' lodgings and things like that. But baseball was really was already part of the economic infrastructure in all of the countries, and the winter leagues were there. The North American players just enhanced the product, probably made more people want to come out to the ballpark. So it was definitely an important economic mainstay for several months for all of these countries. Definitely.
And let's go to Nicaragua now. Joe Hicks, how was interviewing him? That must have been something to be playing in Nicaragua.
Yeah, Joe Hicks was a player. He played, I guess, on 3 different major league teams. He had, I think, a 5-year career. Joe Hicks was unusual, or maybe unique would be a better way of saying it. He actually ended up falling in love and marrying a girl from Nicaragua down there. And when I interviewed him, he was still married to that same young lady young lady named Antoinette. And they had 3 daughters. One of the daughters was named after Antoinette's mother, and another daughter, pretty humorously, was named after Antoinette's sister, who had to accompany them, Hicks and Antoinette, on their first date together. As you know, the chaperone is very, very prevalent in the Latin American cultures as far as dating with girls are concerned. So I got a kick out of that. Joe Hicks was a unique guy. He ended up falling in love and marrying a woman, and was still married to her after 50 years. So that's probably even the better part of the story.
And I like the story here where he went deer hunting. What the heck happened on deer hunting with him?
I remember that. I remember more him telling me when he tried to come back, I think, to the United States. He wanted to bring, I think, a pet monkey with him, but I think his wife talked him out of him. I don't remember the deer hunting story. Did he fall asleep? Was that it?
Yeah, he fell asleep. And then he heard a noise, and a deer came right by, and before he can compose himself, the deer was gone. So it's almost like you go to church and they say, hey, if you're not awake, you're going to miss the coming of Jesus Christ. Yeah, he just missed the coming of the deer by falling asleep.
He missed the union. Yeah, I remember now. Sorry about that.
You know what? I'm going back a few years. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm here with my notes and the book in front of me, so we can both talk about this. Jack Kubison, how does he like the Nicaraguan League?
He liked it pretty much, almost as much as Hicks, but not quite. He played for Cinco Estrellas, and he was actually a Cleveland Indians player. He played 1 year, and he had a good story about Marty Lerner trying to successfully actually smuggle a baby wildcat back through customs to Miami when he returned from Nicaragua. That's what I remember about Jack Kubison.
Oh my God, that's fantastic. How about Phil Reagan? He was down there with them.
Yeah, Phil Reagan. Actually, when I spoke to him, you know what? He was a pitching coach. I think he still is pitching coach with the Port St. Lucie Mets. And I remember that because as we were going into the interview, he had to cut off the interview because he told me he had to go warm up his pitchers. So he was actually still active in baseball when I spoke to him.
Oh, that's fantastic. And you got Dick Stigman. How did he like it down there in Nicaragua?
Yeah, Dick Stigman, left-handed pitcher. He played with Cleveland and Minnesota. I guess he's best known with Minnesota. He was one of the top pitchers actually down there. A lot of these players, they really performed well. So that was another thing that made them stand out. They became well known in the leagues that they played for. But again, I think it was another situation where he played 1 year down there, and he told me a story about when he went to, I think, go to the movies with a couple of his buddies, and he saw a movie, and it struck him, being a foreigner, that he was able to go to the movies and see a movie in English but with Spanish subtitles. And when he came out of the movie, this was during the Trujillo era, and he said during one of the times he was in the movie theater, he heard a loud explosion, but it wasn't big enough to rile everybody up from the theater. But when the movie ended and they went outside, they found a car that had been blown up. Again, there was a lot of unrest in Latin America during this time. This was the time of strong armed governments, and Nicaragua was no exception to that.
I remember Nicaragua in the late 70s and the early 80s with the Sandinistas and the whole the whole war, the whole thing with Reagan, the Nicaraguan Iran Contra, and all that stuff, that arms are being sent to Latin America and Nicaragua, just like El Salvador. They were at the cusp of all these revolutions and stuff like that. Now let's go to Panama over here. Tony, how do you say his last name? Bartolome?
Bartolome.
Bartolome.
Bartolome. The E is silent.
All right, Bartolome. Yeah, he was a Pittsburgh guy. He liked Paul Wainer and his brother Lloyd Wainer, Pine Trader, signed him to his first contract. How did he do that in Panama? That must have been something to see the canal.
Yeah, he told me he lived with the other players actually in the air base down there. So that's where he lived down there. And he got to play in the Caribbean Series because the team he was on was a champion of that league. That was the Carta Vieja Yankees. And they went to Puerto Rico. This was the 1958 Caribbean Series. They went to Puerto Rico. And the game he most remembered was a game which Juan Pizarro dominated. He's a Puerto Rican left-hander. He had pitched many years with the White Sox, really a hard-throwing left-hander. And Pizarro dominated the game. He pitched a two-hitter and won 2-0, I think, was the final score. And the funny thing was to him that later on, when Bartolome was a coach and with the Pirates and Pizarro came up with the team or was traded to the team, he reminded Pizarro, I should say, that hey, I got one of the two hits against you in that game, that great game you pitched in the Caribbean Series 10 years ago or whenever it was. So that's what he took out of that.
And you got his teammate over here too, Jerry Davy. He played with Bartolome.
Yeah, Jerry Davy, the humble guy. Again, not a big name player in the major leagues, but down there he was well known. In fact, he was so well known and became so well liked that there was a popular song at the time, pop song called "Sherry Baby." And,
that's right.
The fans down there, they used to serenade him with a little tweaking of it, and they called him every time he came to the plate, they'd sing out Jerry Davy, Jerry Davy, mimicking Cherry Baby, you know. So that was one of the things he most remembered about, and he enjoyed that. Actually, it spurred him on. He said.
You know, the fans in Panama, he said, were really fantastic down there. They really love baseball.
Yeah, the fans in Panama were no different than really all the other countries. They were very ardent fans, and they really supported their teams. And it must have been really great to play for fans like that.
You know, with Davey, he saw some other leagues, but in his opinion, the best winter league he played in, which he saw, was the Panamanian League. It was Hector Lopez. He said was the best pitcher he ever saw with the Humberto Robinson.
Right. I asked. That was another thing. I always tried to ask the players who were the best players they saw down there in their respective leagues. And as you said, Davey mentioned Hector Lopez, who gained fame with the Yankees. He was probably the best-known player to come out of Panama until Rod Carew. And he mentioned Humberto Robinson. He was a right-handed pitcher, hard thrower, who came up with the Milwaukee Braves. And Humberto Robinson, was the first player from Panama to make it to the major leagues.
Wow. Yeah, I think, wasn't Mariano Rivera down from Panama as well?
Definitely.
Yeah, and so was Bertie Williams also down from Panama? I forget who else was down from Panama.
Actually, Bertie Williams, yeah, he's from Puerto Rico, but there was a lot of other players that played from Panama. Dave Roberts, one of the players I interviewed, he was born in the Canal Zone.
Yeah, that's right. I was going to get to him next. There was 9 of them in his family. Now, he was born in the Canals, so again, it was controlled by the United States at that time.
Right. And again, the Canal Zone at that time, according to Roberts, it was basically a segregated situation. So his idols growing up were Jackie Robinson and a guy named Alonzo Braithwaite, who was a local player, probably not a name familiar to most baseball fans, but in Panama he was well known.
Yeah, and he also told you about the Caribbean series. How was that?
Yeah, he was able to go to the 1953 Caribbean series again. For those that don't know too much about that, that was a series that was started in 1949, and it pitted the champions of each league from Cuba, Puerto Rico, Panama, and Venezuela. So playing in Panama, his team won the pennant that year, so they represented Panama in the Caribbean Series. And his first Caribbean Series, as a young kid, he told me he was like in his early 20s, and he was really struck by meeting all these players that he had read about from his youth. And, of course, one of the players was one you mentioned earlier, Martin Digo, nicknamed El Inmortal, and that was probably his biggest thrill. He said in the book about meeting Digo, playing against him, or actually not playing against him. Digo had already retired by then, but actually getting a chance to meet him. He also Roberts got a kick out of playing against Ruben Gomez, which was a great pitcher in the Puerto Rican League. He also pitched for the New York Giants. And again, that was one of his all-time favorite players. Willard Brown and Bob Thurman were also 2 other players that he mentioned that he really looked up to. And again, it's just a dream of a young player making it to the big time and being on the same field as the people as the players he grew up idolizing. It's just a recurring theme in our great sport.
And the ownership in Panama was very committed to presenting good players, fast players, people who are proficient in baseball. These were not amateurs. But he does mention one owner, Carlos Elada. Let's talk about Carlos here.
I think he mentioned him as a player who really, as a player's owner, someone who really cared about the players and actually put their well-being maybe even ahead of the team. And he also, I think his failing was the subordinates he had around him didn't have the same type of benevolent feeling toward the players, and in that respect, they betrayed him, and in doing so, they betrayed the players. So Roberts had a great deal of respect for Elada, the owner, but because of other circumstances surrounding him, he feels he didn't really become the man he could have become. So it really wasn't his fault, although you might say that he could have done better in micromanaging, if you want to put it that way. But it doesn't take away from his position as a top owner in Panama during this time.
And you know something? It's interesting because you always hear about the labor relations in the United States, and you heard it with Pascal in Mexico. But here it opens up a question to me, because Elada, he owned all the tobacco concessions in Panama. So he had the kind of means to pay his ball players probably, a little bit better than what most other teams were doing. But in other countries besides Mexico, how is the labor relations between the players and the owners?
Well, it was pretty much the same as it was in the United States. The players were signed to one-year contracts. The owners could, terminate that contract at any time with 10 or 13 days written notice. I know as far as money was concerned, North American players, for the most part, unless you were like a Minnie Minoso or a well-known player in your league, they were always paid more than the local players. But as far as the labor relation, it was basically, taking the blueprint taken from the major leagues. Ownership had wielded the authority.
Yeah, and that's again, because they did, you had players defecting to the Mexican League in the mid-40s, especially after World War II. During the 30s, no one really complained. They were paid better, and they had a depression on, so everybody had, to be thankful that they had a job. But that all changed in the 1950s and 60s. And, now that we're getting to Puerto Rico, the first person that we always think of from Puerto Rico is Roberto Clemente. The guy was just an unbelievable athlete. He never liked to be compared to other players. But you also had a slew of other people down in Puerto Rico. One of them was Pete Burnside, and he saw the Alous play. Well, what did Pete think about Puerto Rico?
Yeah, Pete Burnside played in Puerto Rico, and he also played in the Dominican Republic, where you said he saw the Alous brothers when they were young. Burnside, he was a left-handed pitcher. He played for Santurce, and I think his biggest claim to fame was in the Dominican League. He pitched the championship game for the Escogido Lions. They won the 1960 championship, and that championship game was actually the 9th game of the series. It was a best 5 out of 9 game, and he pitched a complete 3-2 victory. Actually, he pitched for the Licey Tigers. Sorry, he beat Escogido 3-2. Escogido and Licey were the two top teams. They both were situated in the capital of the Dominican Republic, so they had the biggest following in the Dominican Republic, and they were the biggest rivals, and that was a very rabid series, and it went down in history as an all-time great series.
And you also interviewed Ellis Cott-Deal over here, and he was very willing to talk to you. What did he tell you about life in Puerto Rico?
Yeah, Ellis Cott-Deal. Cott-Deal was probably one of the more popular North American players to play in Puerto Rico. So popular that they actually dedicated a night to him, Cott-Deal night, and he was given a automobile and a Puerto Rican flag, and he came out onto the field with his wife and little son, and said it was one of the best memories he ever had in baseball, anywhere in baseball. Yeah, he was a great interview. He played several years down in Puerto Rico, and he played with a couple of different teams, but he got to be so well known down there. He got to be known as a nickname. They called him Mr. Reinforcement. That's what they used to call North American players. They would reinforce the teams. So that's where that nickname came from, Mr. Reinforcement.
It makes perfect sense. How about Jack Fisher? How do you like living down there in Puerto Rico?
Jack Fisher spent 2 years down there, and he pitched a championship clinching game for his team. He was on the San Juan Senators, and he defeated the Caguas Criollos in a best of 9 championship series, also best 5 out of 9, and he beat them 5-3. He told me one time he got carried into a bar down there, and all of a sudden they placed a drink in front of him, and he went to reach for his wallet, and he looked back, and his wallet had been just stripped right out of his pocket behind him. I remember him telling me that. But he said it good-naturedly. Apparently he didn't have too much money in there, or it was just such a great time following the victory that he didn't mind it too much. But he did like Puerto Rico. He was no different than most of the players who played in the Winter League. they were positive experiences for him.
Now, here's a guy who you personally met, Louis Olmo. How was that?
Yeah, Mr. Olmo, he and Monty Irvin were the two oldest players I interviewed. They were both born, believe it or not, in 1919. And with Mr. Olmo, I mentioned I went down to Puerto Rico, to San Juan, to spend a couple of days. And one of the days, he was gracious enough, Mr. Olmo was, to invite me to his home. So I got a chance to go to his home. And before I continue, let me just say Luis Olmo is a great trivia question answer. Luis Olmo was the first Hispanic player to hit a home run in the World Series. He did that in the 49 World Series against the Yankees. He hit it off of Joe Page, actually, top-notch reliever back then. So there's your big trivia question answer for today.
That's fantastic. And hey, I think you even have a picture of you and Olmo in the preface over here. So,
yeah, it was just enough to give me a photograph. That was actually at a SABR meeting they had in San Juan. I was a guest speaker down there, so he attended, and Jose Santiago, another player, attended, and I got to meet Jose Santiago and interview him. Nino Escalera. That's one of the great things about the SABR meetings down there, that former players, they're invited all the time, and they drop in all the time. And as you mentioned, I took advantage of Luis Olmo's appearance by snatching up a photo with him.
I think it's fantastic. Finally, let's get to the Venezuelan Winter Leagues. I think this is the most southern of all the Latin American countries that you deal with. But Gary Blaylock, how do you like playing in South America?
Gary Blaylock was a Cardinals prospect. His first year down there was, I guess, 1959 with a team called Valencia. And as a matter of fact, he had a very auspicious debut. He pitched a one-hit shutout his first time to the mound. So obviously, as far as performance, he enjoyed his time quite a bit. And
then you shift to Billy DeMars over here. He played for the pennant-winning team in his one season in Venezuela. How did he view the sport down there and the fans?
Yeah, Billy DeMars was a Brooklyn-born player. He played in the major leagues in the 1940s, so he was actually out of the majors at this time, but obviously still active in minor league ball, and he had a chance to go down to Venezuela in the early 50s, and he was on the Caracas team, the capital city team, in 1952-53, and they were the league champions that year. And their manager, a name that keeps popping up in all of this, Martin Digo. So Caracas managed Martin Digo, and I was able to get a photo of the team, a team photo, and I put it in the book there. And it's quite interesting. They had quite a few different players. Chico Carrasquel was on that team. Carl Erskine, Brooklyn Dodger fans are going to remember that name. He was on that team. And Billy DeMars, as you mentioned, was on that team. Oh, and Pompayo Davalillo was on that team. So he was Vic Davalillo's brother. Vic Davalillo made it to the major league. So did Pompayo, but he only played, I think, 1 year with the Senators. But Vic Davalillo was the more known brother.
And the last one that I'd like to get into here is you label the chapter "The Passing of an Era." Don LePere. He played in 3 different countries over here. What's going on with Dono?
He was unique in that respect. Although he wasn't alone, there were other players that played in 3 different leagues. I remember Ed Roebuck did. He played in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic. So he wasn't unique, but Leopard I put at the end because he played in the winter leagues once the Cuban Revolution had taken over and changed really baseball in the Caribbean forever. The elimination of the Caribbean Series for 10 years followed the Cuban Revolution's elimination of sports, and Leopard really he jumped both eras. I can't remember. I don't know what the word was. He he leapt from one era to the other, and he went from the old-time organized baseball Winter League era to the post-Cuban Revolutionary era, where things from whatever point of view you want to look at it, things sort of deteriorated because Cuba really wasn't involved in Winter League sports. And Leopard played for Venezuela team. Let's see, he was a manager he also became a manager later on in Venezuela and the Dominican Republic. So he got to see things before as a player and then after as a manager.
That's fantastic. Let me ask you this. With your, interviews of all these folks and going back in time, in the more modern leagues now, we know that Latin America, the Caribbean, and South America have stellar teams. My question to you is that do you think it's better organized and more fans than there are today than there were years ago?
I guess it all depends on where. Certain countries are having it better than others. Puerto Rico, even before the hurricane this past summer, they were having problems with their winter leagues. The number of teams had contracted. Actually, Venezuela, again, with their problems, political problems, their leagues aren't as robust as they used to be. I would say, and of course, Cuba has also declined with the defections over the past decade or so or more. Panama, again, they have a professional league, but I believe the last time I checked, it was just one or two teams. They're not even involved in the revived Caribbean Series anymore. I would just have to think that what you're seeing in the winter leagues now are more academy-driven type of situations as far as trying to find the next generation of players. Major League Baseball has academies in all of the countries I mentioned except Cuba, and so which is good because in a way they not only help the players develop a potential talent to reach in the major leagues, but they also help them in something that players never had before, and that's cultural assimilation. They teach the players maybe an hour or two a day of English classes. That's a requirement. So as far as the infrastructure itself, I don't think it's like it used to be with a self-autonomous, so to speaking, ownership. Every team had different owners and a self-governing league, although it's still the same that way, but there's the major league influence with the academies. I mean, that's I feel is happening now in the winter leagues as far as a difference from now to 20, 30, even 50 years ago.
And now more than ever, most of the United States baseball players are from Latin America and the Caribbean and the South American countries. I think with all their academies, I think whatever on a collective basis, whether it's just an individual country, they're doing something right because they're putting out good products, which the United States, Major League Baseball, organized baseball, is starting to import, or has been importing them for years. And they're really, really doing better than I think African-American players or even the white players here in the major leagues. I think that the Caribbean and the whole Latin America, they got baseball right where they want it, and it can become very lucrative for them if they hone in on organized leagues.
The Hispanic players are the largest the largest minority in the major leagues. They have surpassed African Americans as the biggest minority. I look to places also internationally like Japan and Korea. I think Japan, the way their baseball leagues are structured, is more similar to how it used to be in the winter leagues. They have individual ownership, of course, not trying to equal the money at all, just have to separate the money because it's so much different now than before. But I think I would compare Japan more to the winter leagues of 50 or 60 years ago than now. And of course, the Dominican Republic deserves a tip of the cap. They just generate players, galore, and they are the biggest Hispanic ethnicity in the major leagues, and they have been for, 20, 30 years now. So don't forget the Dominican Republic. I mean, those players, I guess they're born with gloves in their hands practically. It's just remarkable to see that country and the talent of baseball pool that it produces.
I could not believe in the World Cup baseball last year that the Americans actually beat the Dominicans, and they also beat Puerto Rico for that matter, because they probably had the two best teams going into the World Cup of baseball, and they are, like you said, probably born with a bat, ball, and glove in their hands, because I think Pedro Martinez was from there, Big Papi was from there, if I'm not mistaken, but the Dominicans are doing something right over there.
Yeah, those two players are definitely Dominican natives, and I actually thought Puerto Rico had a chance to beat the U.S. in the finals in the World Baseball Classic, but the U.S. pitching was just a little bit superior. Those guys did a really good job from the mound, and I got to admit, though, the victory was long overdue. The U.S. needed to win one to save grace a little bit.
Well, they haven't won. It was Japan, I think, that won the first one. I think Dominican won another one. I think Puerto Rico won, if I'm not mistaken. But the United States has not put a good fielding team until last year. I was very surprised. Then because, again, this country is not taking baseball as seriously as it did. It's dropped to probably fourth in the American pastime now, behind football, basketball, and hockey. And there's less little leagues now. There's less, intercity camps where they can hone in from within the country, which is why they're looking to other places in the world, and why really it's immersing different cultures into Major League Baseball, because everything is down in baseball except the money. Then, of course, that rules. But, hey, Lou, did you have a good time today? I had a fantastic time with you on the show again.
Sure did. It was great to revive all these old anecdotes, and really to revive the names of the players that really deserved a lot more than history has given them.
Yeah, and you did a fantastic job with the book. I think McFarlane still has it. You can get it at Amazon. Where else can we get this fabulous book?
I think Barnes & Noble's website still has it, but if not, the publisher McFarlane and Amazon, they definitely do.
Now, what are you working on? I remember asking this in the fall, but of course I'm getting older and I'm getting Alzheimer's. So, what are you working on now? McGraw, right? I was thinking of. Were you doing John McGraw?
The McGraw book hopefully will be coming out in March. That's the last I heard. So that's my next book, and then I have another one after that. It's a biography. It's my second biography. It's going to be on Bobby Maduro and the Cuban Sugar Kings.
Am I going to have to send both those books to me? Let me know when it comes out. You can be on the show because I love reading your material. My book, it's going to be a while. It'll be coming out around July, and that was with Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker. So I do mention McGraw and how he wanted Ty Cobb when the whole thing went down with the whole scandal, and they they got rid of him, Ty Cobb, and McGraw was trying to get him for the National League. And, of course, back then, again, two different leagues, you couldn't trade within the leagues unless the commissioner or the president allowed it. So very interesting stuff, more good stuff that we can learn about. Hang on for 1 second. Let me end the show. I'll talk to you after the show. Folks, had a great time learning more about the Latin American leagues. Go out, get the book. Very important part of baseball history. What we see now on the field, it's always good to go back and trace the roots from all these different countries that now contribute to what I like to consider a very big melting pot, and especially going down into the Caribbean and to South America and Latin America. Very important to learn about culture and what these players actually went through, saw, ate, and lived in these countries back when, well, things are more primitive. But, it's also a great sense of history because you get to go through time periods and you get to measure up. One thing I will add was Doug Harvey last week, the umpire, who passed away at the age of 87. He was down in the Puerto Rican leagues for one season to craft his art of umpiring. And wouldn't you know it, as soon as a bad call was made by another umpire, there was riots in the stands. So we'll go back to 61 on that. But I just wanted to throw that in. So rest in peace, Doug Harvey. As always, I'm Ian Kahanowitz on behalf of Lou Hernandez and the Comfy Zone Radio Network, and in the immortal words of my hero on broadcasting, Edward R. Murrow. Good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.